to have to sit and watch all of that. And thanks, I guess, to my co-authors and my students for doing a good job of embarrassing me. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Americus and Mark for an amazing, we're all over the place, for an amazing conference that they've put together. And also, of course, Kate and Mike for the document course consortium yesterday. Thanks to them, when I called them and asked them to do this service, they all were excited to do so and just really jumped at the opportunity. So a big thanks to them. I also, I also should thank the wonderful people that I've worked with at SCP. And I've been blown away by how much the people in this field care about the field. And that goes across the board. But I've been lucky enough to work with some people at SCP over the last couple of years that have really impressed me. And I think of Vicki and Michelle and Larry and Tina and Tiffany and now Susan and Stein. And it's been a real pleasure for me to work with these individuals. I mean, I'm blown away by how much they care and how hard they work for something that they believe in. So I want to thank them for letting me be part of their group and to have the experience to help move the society forward. Now, in terms of a presidential address, there's lots of ways you can go here. And so I thought, I'd do pretty much what I typically do in these types of situations and tell stories. And so I wanted to start by talking a little bit about one of the things that I love in this job. And this job is awesome. Why? And those of you that have been doing it for years know that it's awesome. Those of you that are starting it are hoping that it's awesome. But to me, one of the big reasons it's awesome is you get to teach. And I just love teaching. It's one of the favorite things I do. When you start as a professor, right, you have to teach the class of consumer behavior, intro to marketing. You roll that out for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And then you kind of get bored of it. And so you start trying to teach other things. And I, about 4 or 5 years ago, got inspired by Joe Priester. I don't know if Joe's here today, but he inspired me because he teaches a class in creativity. And I thought, Joe can kick some butt and teach a great class like that. There's maybe room for me to do that in my school. And I've done some research in creativity, and then they tell you you're supposed to put the research in the classroom. And so I thought, okay, let's do it. So I started to populate the course, and I did crazy things, right? I didn't have a syllabus, and there was no marking, and there was no assigned classroom. They'd get an email the day before the class, and it would be like, class is here, and then they'd have to come to it, right? And so you just tried to play with their minds, and it was really fun. And as I populated the class with topics, it was easy to do visualization, because I wrote a paper about that. It was easy to do a class on analogy. I tried to fill up all the classes with my papers, because it's easy. But I didn't have enough papers. And so I realized I better think of some other things that are related to creativity. And one thing that popped out was this notion of play. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of fun, right? I can get crazy with play. And so I searched on the internet, and I found out that Lego, right, has a consulting arm called Lego Serious Play. And I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I'll have a class with MBAs, and we'll just bring in a bunch of Lego. And I'll say, play. Be creative. It'll be amazing, right? But I was struck at how crappy MBAs are at playing. I said, here you have 2 hours. Here's the Lego play. And what the MBAs would do is they'd, have a little huddle, decide who was in charge, right? And then they'd go ahead and they'd execute on the plan, and they'd build this structure. And it usually would take them about 25 minutes. And then they'd stand around for the rest of the hour just kind of going, yeah, now what do we do, right? And they couldn't do it. So I thought, well, maybe I can use another type of exercise to help them learn how to play. And so I chose, what's become a very famous, I'm sure some of you have used it, right? The Marshmallow Challenge. Great TED Talk on it, and it's kind of fun. Again, you're given a challenge. You're given a marshmallow, a bunch of sticks of spaghetti, some string, and some tape, right? And you're supposed to make these towers. And then you put the marshmallow on at the top. And whoever builds the tallest tower wins, right? And so students love this kind of stuff, right? So you get your MBAs, same thing happens, right? They decide who's the president, who's the VP of marketing, right? And they design the tower, and then they build it. And again, they finish before the time allotted, right? They give it 19 minutes to do it. They do it in 12. And they're like, look at us, we're MBAs, right? And they put the marshmallow on top, and the big, for those of you that don't know, the big joke at the end of it is, the tower typically crumbles because the spaghetti, right, can't sustain the weight of the marshmallow. And so they fail, they don't play. And I sit back and I kind of wonder, why are they so lousy at this? And it made me think, maybe there's more to this play thing than I realized. So I started like any good academic, started to look in the literature, right? What is the definition? What is the construct of play? And what I found was really surprising to me is it's one of those constructs that you don't want to put into the review process. It's a bit nebulous, right? There's no set definition, but there's a lot of work on play. Not a lot of work in our field. But I picked 3 authors that I thought were pretty impressive in this area, just to give you a little background, right? Not to give you a formal definition, but just kind of share with you a bit what we know about play. And the first one, you know he's huge if they have a stamp on him from his country, right? And Johann Huizinga, this individual is seminal, a historian with a number of amazing books, and he wrote about play. He's one of the first authors to really talk about play in an academic sense. His book was called Homo Ludens. It was written in 1938, and what he was trying to do was to make the thesis and the argument that play is fundamental to us as human beings. It's something that we just do. And we heard a poke at that in the talk just before lunch. It's something that is part of us. And he makes the argument that all culture comes from play. Now, that's kind of interesting. And I read a little bit more about this book and about him, and I learned that he wrote this book as kind of a pushback against this Protestant work ethic. Because at that point in time, you were not allowed to play at work, right? Work and play were opposite. And there was even movements like in the Ford Manufacturing Company where, if you laughed at work, it was a punishable offense. Play was something for children. It was something that, as adults and as workers, you weren't supposed to do. He wanted to push back on it. That was carried up by Brian Sutton-Smith, a professor at Wharton, a psychologist by training, but he's a professor in education. And he wrote a nice book also on play called The Ambiguity of Play. And he tried to expand. His contribution was he expanded this initial notion, right, that was started by Johann, that play had a number of facets that empowered, if you will, empowered a human. And so play was part of gaining power. Play was part of identity. Play was part of frivolity and fun in someone's life. And so he tried to expand the notion of play and also push back against this notion that work and play were opposites. In fact, he's very famous for saying that the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. And so building on that, as we move into a much more contemporary author, Stuart Brown, who, different from these two, is actually a medical doctor, a clinician. He did his dissertation work in Texas, in prisons. And what he tried to do was identify, right, how the lack of play by inmates was a direct causal force in them being incarcerated. He did some kind of interesting work in a clinical sense to try to understand if you miss out on this play, what happens. Now, he tried to define play a little bit, and this isn't really a working definition, but it gives you an idea, right, of some of the aspects that make up play. The first one is it's apparently purposeless. In other words, when you play, you're not doing it for money. You're just playing because it's something that's inert and you just want to do it. Play is voluntary. There's an inherent attraction to it, which means you're going to enjoy it. Most of the time, it will provide you happiness. You have a freedom from time. And when you think of our speaker last year, how you're talking about flow, this is what happens when you're in a flow state. You're not aware of the time. You're not watching the clock when you're playing. Diminished consciousness. You're not conscious of yourself. You're not impression managing when you're playing. And this is the one that obviously that's important to us, it provides an improvisational potential where things can just pop out. Serendipity, you can discover things when you play. And the last one is you want to continue to play. And when you take all of these things and put them together, you start to get a sense of what this notion of play really is. That's great. Academic definitions, right? Yay. But what does it mean? Why is it important? And I would push a little bit to the animal kingdom, right? Because some of the coolest research on play, and some of it's quite debatable, is based in the animal kingdom. And one of my favorite stories is about a group of scientists that were in the Northwest Territories on the verge of the Hudson's Bay. And they had set up camp because they wanted to watch the polar bears. With global warming and the ice not as strong, polar bears having a bit of a tough time these days because they can't get on the ice floes and feed. And so they had set up camp, and they were watching the bears, and they had a couple husky sled dogs, right, that were with them at the camp. And one night, they noticed a bear coming to encroach on camp, and so the scientists backed off, and the bear came in and approached one of the dogs. Now, this bear was hungry, it was thin, right, and as it approached the dog took what's called a submissive play cue, right, and scientists study this, but it's a way that animals indicate to another animal that they want to play. And the bear did the exact same thing back. And the scientists watched, and they watched the two play with each other, to the point that the bear actually got on its back and let the dog play on his stomach. And they did this for half an hour, and the whole time the scientist was like, this isn't going to end well. But it did. The bear eventually got up and ambled off. Wow. What was interesting is the bear came back for 7 days while the encampment was there and played with the dog every single day. And they were blown away by that. And they said, why? And when you look at the literature in this area, right, if you take an evolutionary perspective, play is important in the animal kingdom. If it wasn't, the animals that play would be gone. And so why do people play? Why do animals play? Well, the belief is that it's the way to deal with an uncertain world. If you're an animal, play enables you to meet the unpredictable. It teaches you skills that help you survive. It enables you to socialize. And you can see the direct parallel with humans, right? When you think of kids, and those of you that have kids, right, you may know the book, The Power of Play. It's a great book, right, by David Elkind. And he talks about why, when you're little, you need to play. And when you have kids today, there's some fear. Some people feel that they're not playing enough. Imaginative play, rough and tumble play, all different forms of play that you need when you're young. In fact, if you go back to that Texas prison study, it was the absence of rough and tumble play when you're young that prevents you from understanding how to deal with conflict, which leads you to be more violent in terms of your outputs later in life. Fascinating types of work at that developmental level. But what's even more interesting, more recently, there's been a look at, well, what about play when you get older? And there's evidence, some evidence that shows that playing as an adult enhances your memory, helps you slow down disease, and physically makes you better. Helps you live longer. And when you think about it, when you play, there's lots of different ways to play. You feel good, you feel energized, and you come back into a situation much happier. When we think about academia, though, and this is where I'll start to shift the talk, right? Play is something that's incredibly important for what we do. And I'll use this example of otters. In a study, they were trying to teach otters a very simple learning trick, right? To swim through a hoop, and you get some food as a reward. And so the otters could do that, fairly smart animals, and they would swim through the hoop, and they'd get the treat, get the food. But what they noticed over time is that the otters started to play with the exercise. And they'd swim around the hoop. They'd swim through the hoop together. They'd swim backwards through the hoop. They'd swim halfway through, all then looking up to see, hey, do I get the treat? They would play to experiment and to understand, to try to see what the boundaries are with respect to creativity. And that's where it relates, I believe, right, to academia. Because our job is to discover. And when you think about, writing a good paper, it should be based on this notion of discovery. When I first thought about this, I thought back to a classic story in my life, which is deals with one of these, and I know a number of people have been on these, obviously, you attended these. You go to these research camps, right, that different schools have. And the very first research camp I went to was Washington State, right? And I was super excited. I was going to Washington State. It's in the middle of nowhere, but that's okay. It was really exciting to go, right? It was my first, And I remember going, and the other fellow that they had invited, a good friend of mine and actually a co-author now, many of you know him, is Gavin Fitzsimmons. And so both of us show up at this camp, and I got to tell you, it was a good time. Back to those pre-game slides there. Yeah, we had fun. But I remember sitting with the PhD students, because often in camps and consortiums, they ask for advice on, well, what should you do to be successful? And I remember sitting in the room, and I didn't quite know what to say. This was my first time, and Gavin had done this many times. And I remember the student said, you guys have been successful. What did you do to be successful? And without losing a beat, and those of you that know Gavin, he goes, you work hard, and that's all you do. He says, if my students aren't working harder than me, they're not my students, right? And I'm like, you're scaring me, Gavin. And I sat there thinking, he's right? Working hard is probably the most important thing. And those that attended the doctoral consortium yesterday, they did a survey. Some of you remember this vividly, right? And the biggest thing that came out of the survey was hard work. That if you want to succeed as an academic in today's, well, I think any time, hard work, being passionate, and putting in the time, like the workers in the picture, that's what leads to success. And in hindsight, I still totally agree with that. But I maybe should have said, the ability to play is also something that you should think about in terms of success. Because a number of scientists, you can look at quotes from Einstein, you can look at quotes from Jean Piaget, obviously a very famous developmental psychologist from Switzerland. Play is the answer to how anything new comes about. And I firmly believe this, and I think, frankly, I have a lot of trouble with this lately, because they were really kind to me in the intro. But an interesting thing that a lot of my co-authors and my students have said to me lately is, Darren, you're not as fun as you used to be. And I'm like, oh man, that boy sucks. And it scares me that that's probably true, because I'm a lot more busy, right? And I look at the work that I'm doing now, and I worry sometimes that I'm getting too strategic. And I think, maybe I'm getting a little bit too much cookie cutter and formula and how I do my papers. And I start to worry that if that's the end goal for me, and let's say broader for our community, we're losing something. And so for me, when you think about play, maybe that's something to kick around in your head a little bit. Do you play when you're doing your research? Or are you like the MBAs and you're more concerned on that end goal? I gotta get that A. And you forget about the process. And for me, this has become, frankly, just a big challenge. And I think about the times that I've enjoyed researching. And that goes back to that slide on play. I lose track of time. I'm just in there and we're talking ideas and designs and we're trying stats and we're writing, we're throwing theories at each other. And it makes me think, that's when I'm happy. When I'm writing papers, it's like, oh my God, I gotta run another study. Right? That's not play, that's not fun. And that doesn't promote discovery. And so for me, I challenge everybody. I'll give you 3 little tips that I'm thinking about. My co-authors would say, yeah, he has that problem. But I would challenge you to think about, where does play fit in your research agenda? Because when we look at the papers that you remember, right? And anyone can say here, oh, I love that paper, that one's so cool, that one's so cool. I would argue that those are the papers that have play at the front end of the process. Truly memorable, great work. If you go back to this quote, right, is going to happen. So how do you get some of this fun back, right? I'll leave you with 3 things with some stories attached to them that I think help play. And the first one is being open to creative time to play. And this was the biggest problem that I had. When I entered the PhD program, and my advisors, a couple of them are in the room, they'll tell you that I came out of accounting. I worked very briefly in insolvency. And oh my God, it was soul crushing. But at any rate, I came into the program, and I remember sitting down, and I've told stories a lot about the first projects I did with Jerry Gorn, Chuck Weinberg, and later Amitava, Chuck Paddock came in, and they broke me down from my accounting attitude. Because I was all about, let's get in the room, let's pound it, we'll be done in an hour, the paper will be written. And I'm like, yes. And I didn't realize, and maybe they didn't know this, but they broke me in 2 or 3 years from that type of mentality, where we'd be working, and I remember one story very vividly. We're fighting about some type of theoretical angle, and Jerry and Chuck say to me, that's it, we're going for a walk. I'm like, we're not going for a walk, we're working here. They're like, no, we're going for a walk, let's go down to Wreck Beach. And I didn't know what Wreck Beach was at the time, idiot. And at UBC, those of you that don't know, Wreck Beach surrounds the peninsula of UBC, and Wreck Beach is actually a nude beach. And so we walked down there, and I got down and I'm like, wow, there's a lot to see down here. That totally took me away from where we were, and we started talking as we went back up with these new ideas coming into play, and it was playful. And it was fun. And I think about that type of experience, and I think about what we know, and some of you may know this, the slow movement, right? 1986, Carlos Petrini in Italy, just below the Spanish Steps, the piazza there, did this big anger/protest against McDonald's, right? And he protested this notion of fast food. Because his argument was slow food is something that we need to think about in society. And that actually built momentum. And there's a famous book written by Carl Hernandez in 2004, a journalist, about In Praise of Slow is the title. And the whole notion is not that you should slow down and stop, but that society is consumed with going faster. And then instead of going faster, right, the slow movement pushes us to think not about being a snail, but just taking time to create quality in what we do. So to me, that's the first thing that I push you to think about. And I'm not saying it's easy for me to say, right? Slow down. But there's some value there. There's some value in writing a paper and taking that walk to play a little bit along the way. Enjoy the process. The second one I'd point to is be open to creating playful environments. And, for me, this one, brings back a memory about 6, 7, 8 years ago, probably longer now. But I was sitting in my office up at UBC, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and I'm like, hey, what's going on, right? Not the right way to answer the phone, but that's the way I typically do sometimes. And the person on the other said, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm from Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, and we've been reading one of your JCR papers, and we'd like you to come down and do some consulting work with us. And I'm like, shut up. This is Jonathan LaValle. Are you pumping me right now? And they're like, no, seriously, we've read your paper. I'm like, no, really, nobody reads our papers, come on. And they're like, no, it's this paper on embarrassment, and we're doing some work on one of our brands. We're doing these socially sensitive brands right now, and we'd love you to come down. And so I flew down to Cincinnati, thought this could be really interesting, this could be cool. And what I was surprised by is we didn't go to main campus where all the Rocktoids are, right? No, didn't do that. We went instead to what's called the Clay Street Project. And some of you, those of you from Cincinnati, might know the Clay Street Project. But it's an off-campus site, right? And it creates an environment that's very different than main campus. And when I went into the building and worked the week there, they had all the classic IDEO type stuff. They had big beanbag chairs and the big water guns and Nerf toys. But I was surprised how the environment actually worked. I was in there with the design team. There were some engineers, and there was some finance people, some marketing people, a couple of consumer psychologists, and we worked, and we had fun, and it was creative, and it was all about that specific environment. And thinking about that makes me think of the classic innovation skunk work types idea. And those of you that aren't familiar with skunk works, right? Great history. Skunk works is an idea that is used to facilitate play and creativity in many organizations, from Apple to Google to Gore to 3, wherever. And it started in the 1940s. I don't know if anyone knows the story, but Lockheed Martin was challenged, right? Challenged by the American government to build a jet fighter, because the Germans had built a jet fighter, and we needed to build one fast. 6 months we want a jet fighter. The P-80 shooting star is the name of the jet fighter. And so they decided, Lockheed Martin, we couldn't do it, right, if we had to stay in our regular factory. Instead, we had to create an environment where our engineers could play. So they took a group of engineers to Burbank, California, put them in essentially a big circus tent next to a plastics factory. And they worked, and they did. They called it Skunk Works because it smelled so bad, and they took the name from a Little Abner cartoon. And it became known as a way to facilitate creativity. Part of it was building this playful type environment. When I think about my career, right, a lot of the people that I've worked with have developed a very specific environment where we can be playful. And I'll pick on Paige here, Paige Monroe. Our first paper, because Paige refuses to work in an office. As long as I've known her, whenever I go to work with her, she won't go in an office. So our first paper was written in a food court in Montreal. And we sat in the food court for like 2 hours. I couldn't escape the bad food. And we worked and we just had fun. And it was a playful experience. So I challenge you to think about that. What type of environment can be playful? And in taking the document consortium yesterday, I thought, I had not a big epiphany, but I thought, do I create playful environments for my students? Because if I go back to one of the previous slides, right, if you go back to Johann's work in that book, he talks about environment as a magic circle. And he says a playful environment becomes a magic circle where you feel trust, where you feel openness, and you're willing to say anything. And that, I think, is important for the notion of play and the notion of research. The last one I'll talk about is be open to playful failures. And I picked a picture of a kite because where I live, again on the peninsula, here on the BC coast, one of the things is this really windy section. And so I take my 9-year-old daughter, Alexis, and we try to fly a kite, and we're brutal. We have never succeeded. And I just suck at flying kites. And so her birthday was last week, and of course she got a new kite. It's like this funny joke. But I continually fail. And that's not a bad thing. And when I was preparing the talk, I looked back at my folder of failures. And I don't know if the rest of you have as many folders of failures as I do, but I have this one folder called failure, and then you open it up and there's like 30. And I learned this, I'll pick on Peter Dark in the back row. When I was a PhD student at UBC, Peter Dark was across the hall from me. And any of you that know Peter know when you get into Peter's office, it just becomes playful. You can spend 2 hours, and before you know it, you and Peter have talked about a million things. And many of our first attempts at doing projects ended in failure. I remember one we spent like $6,000, $7,000 on products from other cultures because we were like fascinated by acculturation. Students coming to UBC, right, from other places. Maybe it would be interesting, and we tried all these studies and nothing moved. And Peter and I eventually gave up on it, failure. But from that, we were able to leverage another idea into a project that and resulted in a paper, that I'm really proud of. And I look at all of the failures with my co-authors, and I can point to almost all of them in the room. Some of them, Jennifer Argo, we still have a couple of mannequins that we bought. I don't know why, but they're there. We have I have some nostalgic food from the 60s with Thomas Allard. Andrea Morales tried to get me to buy 3 treadmills for some reason. So failure is something that I've always been excited about. And if you look at the literature in the corporate side, there's a great article called Failure by Design. And to me, thinking about that article and an article by Joe Alba recently in defense of bumbling, right? The notion of trying different things, casting your net out, being open to failure is an interesting thing to think about when you think about play. If I go back to that story at the very beginning that I started with the MBAs, and some of you would know this, the Marshmallow Challenge, right? In the TED Talk, it shows how the MBAs fail, right? And it says in the talk, happily the engineers do much better. So if you look at averages across, right? Business students, lawyers, really bad, right? Engineers good, this is good, right? But what's interesting, who also beats the business students is kids in kindergarten. Kids in kindergarten destroy MBA students in performance. And so the video talks about why. And it comes right back to the beginning. Because kindergarten kids play. They don't decide who's the CEO of Spaghetti Inc. They don't build one single plan. They have fun, and they experiment, and they try different things. And at the end, they come up with more creative and taller structures. And when you think about the message of today, at least what I'd like to leave with you as a presidential address, is think about this notion of play. I wanted to expose the group to it, challenge you a bit in your life to think, where does play actually fit? Now certainly, we all have goals, we all want to publish lots of papers, we all want to do great things. But don't get so caught up in that end goal that you lose the process. Because in my mind, discovery, creativity, and play will make you happier and hopefully will help you produce better work. Thank you.